o'clock in the morning, for me at least. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Let's get going here. So let's talk about basic auth. If you were listening to the keynote a few moments ago, you'll hear it come up quite a lot. So you might think it's quite important to us. So I'm Greg Taylor. I'm a principal program manager at Microsoft. I'm the one turning off basic auth for all of our customers, or rather leading a team of folks which are doing a great job in trying to make sure we drive down usage and we get our customers secure. And we're going to spend the next 50 minutes talking about basic auth, or as I've put in a little parenthesis here, or why turning stuff off is really hard, because it actually kind of is. So what we're going to, all right, sorry. Okay, somebody else took control of my presentation. Who was that? Get off, leave it alone. Okay, so what I want to do here is do a quick bit of a sort of level set for the first couple of slides, then we'll get into the kind of guts really of what we've done with the program, what we're doing, how it's going, and I'm going to sort of share really progress with you, make sure everyone understands kind of how hard this has been. So, but let's, just for a second, think about how much of a problem really is basic auth. It's a huge problem. Let me just kind of, I'll start there. But I mean, password spray attacks where automation makes it incredibly easy to just attack, to guess usernames and passwords en masse at scale in a way which is very hard to identify and attack because it's a spray approach, is a huge problem for us. Now, I'll quickly preface this with, back in 20 years ago, there was a real problem when or it was everyone's username was not equal to their email address. Well, some of you might remember that, right? We had UPN login, and then we had an email address, and of course the users could never remember their login name, but they could they could remember their email address. So then we kind of switched it and let everyone log in with their email address. Well, from an authentication perspective, we just gave away half the problem that you need to go solve. Now we all know what everyone's email address is, therefore we know their username. We just got to guess their password. And trust me, people are terrible at passwords. Everyone reuses passwords, and there's all kinds of problems with that. So this is really kind of, the huge problem that we've seen. And the statistics that I've got on the slide here are pretty shocking in the sense of how much of this really goes on, how much of this we see, how often and how frequently it's happening. And so in reality, the reason we're really turning off basic auth is not just to give you all a bit of extra work, which we know you don't need, but it's genuinely to protect your user accounts and your data. I'm going to show you some numbers as well that will give you an idea of kind of what we see. So from your perspective, from a customer's perspective or a partner's perspective or the public perspective, here's what we're doing. Just level set again on the program. Starting October 1st, which is a matter of weeks away from when we do this recording, we're going to turn off basic auth for POP and IMAP, the protocols that Outlook uses, which includes EWS, which is used by many other things too, ActiveSync and remote and Exchange Online PowerShell, remote PowerShell. So a couple of clarifying things. So all of these protocols support OAuth. We're just turning off the basic auth element. So if the application can use a different authentication protocol, we can carry on using the same underlying code. It's just the auth that changes. I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say this only once. We are not touching SMTP auth. We have previously touched SMTP auth. I've turned off SMTP auth for millions of tenants that don't use it. But come October, we are not touching SMTP auth. Do me a huge favor, people in this community here. When people ask that question, please help me answer that, because I'm getting it's hard to keep repeating myself on this one. Now, back on September 1st, we did announce that customers can get a little more time, and we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. If you were listening to the keynote as well, Perry was asked the question, and I'll quickly upfront it here, which is there are some customers running critical infrastructure. We turn off basic auth for some of these customers, some really bad stuff is going to go down. They're not ready. They know they're not ready. We're working with them, and we're going to get them through it. And we're hoping that they will be perhaps ready in time. If not, they get a little extra time. But it is tough. We know it's tough. We've been on this path for a long time. But there are some opportunities to get a little more time. And the vast majority of our customers are going to be done either by September 30th or by December 31st if they need a little bit more time. Now, if you know you need a little more time, tell us now. use the self-service diagnostic in the admin center, tell us now. We will not touch anything during October. If you do not tell us, we will turn off basic auth for the protocols in your tenant in October. You will be able to re-enable. So let's say we catch somebody by surprise. They didn't see the message center post, they didn't see the blog. They will be able to re-enable, but the same deadline at the end of December will apply. So it's a last opportunity. It isn't a sign of us backing off at all. It is a sign of us recognizing that there are customers who aren't quite ready, who don't know this is coming. Trust me, I talk to them all the time, unfortunately, and who are suddenly realizing that their time is up and they're not ready and some stuff is going to happen. So there's our sort of perspective. Now, that's from a customer perspective. Now, from my perspective, when I started getting involved, now I kind of want to shift gear a bit more about how the program runs and what we're doing, is when I was first asked to sort of get involved in this, my first thing is, well, why are we doing it? You know, what's the point? Now, clearly there's some security benefits, right? I've covered those already. But the real realization, if I may, right? The real realization was that this isn't just about stopping people from using basic auth. It's about protecting tenants from being compromised by basic auth. Now, that might sound simplistic, so let me give you an example. Basic auth is enabled in every Exchange Online tenant and has been forever. And the problem is that most customers don't know that. Some of them do. They control it, they turn it off early, conditional access or whatever they do, great. But many customers don't even know basic auth was enabled, and then they get breached. And so that's kind of crazy, right? So the first realization is, well, why don't we, we're protecting customers from being compromised, not just driving down usage. And I'm going to come back and we'll talk about this to be a recurring theme as we go here, right? That was a huge realization. So my next question on my mind is, right, well, how do we use it? Who do we know who's using it? Which tenants are using it? What are they using? Where are we going to keep track of all of this data as well? What clients or apps are using it? Clearly, we all know about, there's Outlook, there's, mobile devices and stuff, but what else? And then it's a sort of grasp the usage and figure out, what are we going to do about it? How do we break this down? Do we go after it in one big simple solution, or do we have to break it down and try some different scenarios? And then what's the actual process for turning it off? How are we going to actually do that? What's going to happen in support? And then clearly, how do we tell customers? So this is kind of really the point of what the rest of this session is going to be about, which is how certainly I've sort of thought about a lot of these problems and how we have collectively executed on that. Now, the last thing I'll say is when I did go internally to have a look at some internal docs and how do you turn things off, I found this really helpful little graphic. And this helpful little graphic said, all you have to do is announce you're going to do it. Customers will get off the thing and then you can turn it off. And so I looked at that and thought, well, that's really great. Of course, it's a little harder than that, right? So that's the reality. All right, so let's do some data gathering analysis. We did some data gathering analysis. I'm going to show you what we found and how we do it. So, all right. So my life revolves right now in many ways around this big Azure SQL database, which is what we have. And we are collecting telemetry from the Exchange Core Auth team every 30 minutes on who's using basic auth. So every 30 minutes, every connection is using basic auth. I aggregate that data. I know which tenant and which protocol. I don't collect user information. I'm not interested in collecting user level information, which also is a whole other compliance problem, right? Which I don't need. But I don't really care. I work at a tenant level because our controls are tenant level. So I bring in the usage every 30 minutes for who's using basic auth and what they're using. I then also import data from our own configuration information. So we have a number of systems that sort of look at how many, the tenant name and details, the tenant geography, what license alignments they have, what configuration they have. There's a bunch of different data sources I use, and I pull those in and I associate them with the tenant. I then also import here the tenants that have gone through the opt-out process or have re-enabled a protocol. All of that comes together and allows me to build an incredibly powerful picture of tenant configuration and information and usage. For any particular tenant, for the past 18 months, I can tell you quite a lot about their usage of Basic Auth and their configuration, which of course then allows us to, I'm going to hide the chat for a second. So there's a Q&A. I know Nino and the others are going to help out here, and there's Q&A sessions as well we're going to do. So I want to focus just on the content, if I may. So this gives us the ability to be able to make some pretty sophisticated kind of queries, right? Where if I really want to, I could say, give me all the customers in a particular region of the world of a certain size who use this protocol and have, Outlook 2013. And I know the configuration, which then allows me to make some decisions about how I want to do something. And I pass them off to an internal tool we've built or a platform called Symphony. And Symphony is a workflow execution engine. Symphony is also responsible for moving mailboxes around between tenants when they move between forests and all of that kind of stuff. It's a big workflow engine that runs. And essentially, the way I turn off Basic Auth is I get Symphony to run a PowerShell command. And Symphony will then execute this PowerShell command against the target tenant, change the configuration, block a protocol, re-enable a protocol, whatever it might be. And of course, that data then feeds its way back to me through either the tenant configuration information, which updates, or customer goes in and re-enables something or opts out of something. So all of that comes back in as well. So all of that kind of information there allows me to build this sort of circular knowledge of kind of tenant configuration, the changes we make, and keep track of things. So what did that data gathering tell us? Well, there's a couple of numbers here. So the first thing is I'll share that when we started doing this, there were 70 million people using Basic Auth in 4 million tenants. Now, user reactions in Teams, is that a surprise? I'd imagine it probably is. Most people, when I ask them, like, do you have any idea how many people are using Basic Auth? They're wildly off. I don't think I have in this deck how many are still using it, but there's a number that would surprise you too, right? A lot of people were using Basic Auth in a lot of tenants, clearly. Now, another thing that was very useful to do was figure out, we don't just track users, we track requests. Why that's important is, here's a great example, because the question is, if I just look at a tenant who's got one user and another tenant with one user using Basic Auth, do I consider it's only one user? I can just turn it off. But what if this one's doing 50 requests a day and this one's doing 50,000 requests a day? It sort of clearly tells you that there's a difference between a user type of application and an automated application. And maybe the automated application is doing something really critical. Maybe the user is too, right? But it's a question of, do you want to break end users or do you want to break applications? So here's an example. Back in February, I think I got this data from, there were 10 million people using Outlook on a day, which gives you something to throw you a hint there, right? But 10 million people did 60 million requests in that day for mapping. But 1.5 million POP accounts did 80 million requests. So it kind of, it kind of gives you a sense of the protocol. The number of requests that are made is not equal to the number of users there are. So that's why we track all of those. Biggest protocols in use, probably not a surprise: ActiveSync, EWS, and MAPI, which is Outlook. So ActiveSync, I'm going to talk more about what we've done with Apple a little bit later on as well. But ActiveSync mobile devices, there's a ton of usage there. And part of that is, Apple making life easy for our customers when they buy new iPhones and transfer. You get that, you start the new iPhone up and it says, do you want me to transfer all your data and settings across? And you're like, whoa, yeah, it sounds great. So all your pictures of your cat, your family and everything else, they all come across along with all your mail settings, which include the fact that it's using Basic Auth. So now you've got a shiny new iPhone 14 that you laid your hands on, and it's using Basic Auth. So that's a problem for us, which we've tried to address. Outlook, there's a ton of customers who might have up-to-date modern versions of Outlook, but they're still using Basic Auth because the OAuth 2 client profile enabled flag in set organization config is set to false. talk more about that later too. And then there's a bunch of EWS-based apps. There's a bunch of everything. So huge numbers of users using a huge number of apps, whether clients or services. Basic Auth, huge. Lots of small, medium business, EDU, small, medium business for the most part, because they don't care about IT necessarily. They're making pizzas or they're making, whatever it is they're doing. This stuff is not important to them. We're a commodity, we're a service, right? We're just email, like electricity. So they don't read, they don't follow what we're doing. In EDU, if you have kids and if they're at school age, students don't do what you tell them to do anyway. EDUs also suffer the problem because they suffer, attacks from their own users because they install all kinds of random stuff on their machine. So, being an EDU admin, for any here listening, right, you have a tough job. I know and appreciate that. And POP and IMAP sort of figures in there too. There's a ton of POP and IMAP usage in EDU and in other places. There's an awful lot of applications that have used POP and IMAP because it was super simple. And it's been around for years. And so the app keeps working. But when you look at all of that together, right, when you think about how many users are, this was the size of the problem I had to start with, right? How many users are licensed? Because it's not just active users. If you have an active license, if you have a license, you can be logged on to, even if the user isn't using it. So the number of licensed users in a tenant multiplied by the number of tenants, multiplied by the number of protocols, 9 at the time, gives you an idea of these are all the potential sort of access points, compromise points that customers that we see. And it's pretty fast. The data also, if you look at a typical week, so here's a chart from a tool I use quite a lot, which tells me how much basic auth usage is going on. And I haven't put a scale on here, right? But the numbers are relative, I would say. And so you can see the top line here is active sync. Middle two lines are MAPI in green, EWS in blue, and then you've got IMAP and POP at the bottom, followed by remote PowerShell. Now, you can see where the weekends are for one, right? Tuesdays are our busiest days. You can see where the weekends are. What fascinates me too is that active sync, the line along the top here, dips at the weekends, which tells me that these people, there are some people in the world who are better at email than probably all of us, right? Because they don't sync their email at the weekends on their phones. Can you imagine that? Crazy people, right? But some people do not do email at weekends on their devices. Kudos to them. The gap between MAPI and EWS in the middle there, I mean, you can tell like the big drops for the weekends. People shut their computers down at the weekends on Outlook. Huge drop, a huge difference in usage. And the little extra of EWS, all the other EWS-based apps that people use over and above Outlook. And it might not seem like a lot, but 10% roughly is a huge amount. It's a big number. POP and IMAP, pretty consistent. There's your IMAP. Yep, there are some numbers there. I know. So I've messed around a little bit here. You can try and make some guesses if you want, but there's about 1.5 million people using IMAP when this chart was done per day, but a huge number of accounts, nearly 3 million. So it's kind of interesting that it kind of shows intermittent usage. So whenever I look at data for tenants, you have to sort of look at both a short-term view and a longer-term view, because in a short-term view, you get the most sort of current activity, but then infrequent usage is missed. So you have to also look at a long-term view. So these reports that we send and have been sending to tenants every month since October 21 summarize over the course of a month how many unique users we saw. And so when you look at that sort of data and compare it to the day by day, the number of unique users in the case of IMAP would be 2.9 million. But let's say every day, if you looked at a chart like this, it might be 1.6. Gives you an idea of kind of the difference between, or rather consistency or frequency of usage. Another thing to look at here as well is sort of how our usage maps against the size of the tenant for basic auth. So it's a weird chart. Let me try and explain it. The bottom third, in fact, here we go. I think I have a laser pointer, don't I? Check this out. All right, so this is a third of our usage. This middle piece is a third of the usage, and the top pieces are a third of our usage. A third of our usage comes from the 10,000 seat and up customers, and a third of the usage comes from the under 100 seat customers. And obviously a third then comes from the bit in the middle. But the number of tenants is the gold colored line. There's a vast number of tenants accounting for usage under 100 seats. There's a very small number of tenants in the 10,000 seat and up category, right? But they have vast numbers of users. So the reason why I sort of point this out is it's very hard to have a consistent communication kind of approach, right? When at the right-hand end of this scale, you've got a relatively small number of customers with a relatively high amount of, or a very high amount of usage, but you can engage with them, right? They have Microsoft account teams, or they have, admins, they have pros, and you can work with those people. And if one of those customers makes some changes, gets rid of basic auth, 100,000 users might disappear, right? But at the other end of the scale, you might have 100,000 customers who've each got one user. And you can't call 100,000 customers and ask them to stop using basic auth. That's not really possible. So hence why there's another sort of dimension to this problem, which is customer size plays a big part here too, and how you communicate with these customers. Now, I've been done a lot of calls with customers over the past year or so, mainly at the right-hand end of this chart, right? Because I can't call 100,000 pizza shops, it turns out. And when I talk to a lot of these customers, I'm going to share this with you because I think this is important. I have a very similar discussion with many of them. And my favorite diagram on the internet is not an elephant. And yeah, Kai, I know there is no elephant slide in here, I'm sorry. This picture on the right kind of explains how legacy auth works, right, from Exchange Online's perspective. And I show customers and talk through this quite a lot. And I'll quickly walk through it first, and then I'll sort of say why this is important and see if I can help understand why this is important. When a legacy auth, when a basic auth client tries to connect to Exchange Online, unlike a modern auth client, so in fact, let's try modern auth first, just theoretically, it's not on the slide, right? When a modern auth client comes to talk to Exchange and says, hey, I'd like to access my mailbox, please, Exchange will say, do you have a token? The client will say no. And then Exchange will say, all right, well, go talk to Azure, get yourself a token, come back when you're ready. And it does. Great. But in the case of a basic auth client, Exchange accepts the credentials and then proxies them to Active Directory, Okta, whatever it is, ADFS, blah, blah, blah. And then we authenticate the user. Then we head off to Azure on the user's behalf, which is why you'll see, if you ever look in Azure AD sign-in reports, you'll see ROPC, but the client is Exchange Online. That's why. Maybe that's a bit deep for some of you, but I'm going to roll with that. On the user's behalf, we go get tokens that Exchange will use for its own session management. And that's when we check conditional access. Then if we get a clear from conditional access, we come back to Exchange, and the last thing that is checked is CAS mailbox settings for protocol. And we may block the account connection then. The reason I point this out is there is a series of steps that go through to allow a user to access the data, authentication and authorization, right? And so sometimes it can be a little confusing when you look at the logs, and you might say, well, I've blocked the user using IMAP, using set CAS mailbox, but I still see them successfully logging in Azure AD. Well, yeah, it's because Azure AD doesn't actually know Exchange blocked them using set CAS mailbox. That was the very last step. Set CAS mailbox is not the way to block stuff, by the way. Authentication policies are, but as an aside, we'll do that in the Q&A if you want. But when we block basic auth, we block it here. We will simply, at the tenant level per protocol, say, we're not doing basic auth with IMAP, get lost. Now, this is beneficial for a lot of reasons, right? It stops all the traffic going to your identity provider and showing up in Azure and everything else. But it's kind of, that's just how the flow works. So we shift gears slightly and talk about the usage that we see sometimes. And this is usage I've talked through. I see this with customers, and I look at their data and I show them. One thing I've become, it turns out, quite good at spotting is patterns, right? Not only can I tell where the weekends are in the earlier slide, but here's a pattern that I see sometimes, which causes me to be a little alarmed, and this is the kind of thing you need to look out for. It's all about password spray attacks. As password spray attacks, as I mentioned earlier, are, have a go with a whole load of usernames and passwords. Hope you get lucky. Well, when you get lucky, the attack then will stop on that one account, because rechecking the same user's mailbox over and over, unless you happen to hit a really important mailbox, is probably not that interesting. But what they wanted to do was get a successful combination of username and password that they can then try somewhere else. Because that's the thing about basic auth. When all you have is a username and a password, wherever that username and password are used, you now have access. Unlike an OAuth token, which is scoped to a particular resource and for a limited lifetime and all of those things. So here's an example of kind of in the upper table here, where you might see IMAP, particular account, the user account here. I've just made up a garbage name, right? And how many times it has logged in the last 30 days. These accounts at the top here have all logged in a few hundred times in the last 30 days. And then there's one account that logged in once. Now, there aren't that many reasons why a user logs in once in 30 days. Maybe an application can. You can't really draw too many conclusions from this, right? But if an application only logs in once every 30 days, maybe there's your reason. Or maybe it's a user who was testing or an admin or something, right? This could also mean somebody guessed a username and password, because if IMAP's enabled for everyone, which it will be by default unless you've gone and done something, or would have been historically until we've started doing stuff, this could be a sign of a password breach. And then a view I also get then is the types of logins and their success or not in the table below. So in this one, for example, in the same time period, there were 3,381 successful logins, but there were 13,000 plus account not provisioned. What do you think account not provisioned means? We didn't recognize the username. That's not a good sign. So point is, this is what, again, one of the reasons why we're trying to do this. I see this particularly with IMAP right now. IMAP is a big cause for concern here. There are automated attacks. You can go out and find toolkits that will allow you to do automated attacks against all of these against our protocols, combination of usernames and passwords. Do not be a victim. It's happening all the time. That's why we're blocking basic auth. All right, so let's jump in a bit about how do we go about trying to solve this then. So here's my thought process. So we had to break these things down into buckets. Now I've talked about that a little bit already. So I'm looking at what protocols are being used, of these applications, of these client apps, which are using basic auth, which are using OAuth. I do track OAuth, but not nearly to the same degree. I know who's using OAuth, but I don't count really much about it because the number's vast by comparison, right? I'm only interested in basic. But then I've also got to consider, are these direct customers? Are these coming through a partner? Are they involved with a partner in some way? And I've had some brilliant partnerships with a couple of big sort of cloud solution provider partners. But also we have these other government cloud. We have these other clouds too, right? There's our government clouds. There's security clouds. There's 21V cloud in China. There's a whole bunch of stuff. And so all of these are all sort of, how do you approach each one and break it down? Timeline, brackets, realistic. Timeline for this has been challenging. I've got a timeline slide, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then we had to define our communication plan. How do we want to get the message out? I'll touch here because I don't think I have anything else here quickly, but the blog, the Exchange blog, hugely well read, right? One of the top read blogs in tech community. But it pales in comparison to the number of people that use Exchange. So, even though we might have had, a web post or a blog post, viewed 500 million times, which, some of the earlier basic auth ones are, when I gave you an idea of how many tenants are using basic auth, do you think they all know? Message center posts. So message center posts, I'll very quickly just say message center posts are not frequently read by many customers. I'm trying to put that quite delicately. The larger the customer, the more likely they are to read them. The smaller the customer, the less interested they are. And we send a lot of message center posts, don't we? And so it's very hard for smaller customers in particular to read all of these message center posts and know which are the important ones and what do I have to take action on. So message center posts are hard. Service health dashboard notifications, we have, in fact, I'm probably going to come back and talk about this a little bit more, but we've done stuff around service health dashboard. They're far more red. So then we have to figure out how I'm going to turn things off, and then tracking and reporting here as well. Okay, so the timeline has shifted a couple of times. First time, in reality, customers were given 12 months. It was not enough time. I pushed it for that reason. The second time was because of a pandemic, which none of us saw coming, and it really caused customers' priorities to shift. So, kind of how, that was the second reason, just for shifting the priority. So what we actually sort of focused on was adjusting, or I sort of took the approach that, look, why don't we turn off what we can turn off, rather than just drive down usage? Going back to a point I made right at the top, right, which is, this isn't just about driving down usage, this is about protecting customers. So we took the data and we figured out, well, why don't we start turning off basic auth for customers that don't use it, of which there were millions, by the way. And that's the blue point on this chart here, right? So here's our blue section here, which is turning off customers that don't use basic auth. And we turned off basic auth for millions of tenants that didn't use it. Now, we did build a self-help diagnostic to enable customers to re-enable it. Brilliant. I want to talk about that as well a little bit. But this was a huge thing for us to do. We started turning stuff off for stuff that wasn't in use. And then we moved with the yellow phase here into turning off individual protocols within tenants that were using it a bit. Then we turned some things off for 48 hours as well. We're going to come back and talk about that and when we did that. So right now, today, we are very much on the cusp of about to turn things off for all kinds of customers. The purple line here represents many other tenants that exist in our system, test tenants and other kind of tenants. We're turning those off consistently. There's a lot of other, because we're doing this on a per tenant basis and not a service-wide basis, we have to visit every single tenant, hence why we need a big automation engine. So the actual process for turning things off, here's how we kind of did this. So we originally built an org-wide control to block basic auth at a per protocol level. And it's the very first thing in the auth stack. So if you remember the diagram from a few slides ago, we have the connection coming in. Now at that stage, authentication policies are applied. They're the very first thing Exchange applies. And we're actually even earlier than that. So once we block basic auth for a protocol, authentication policies do absolutely nothing for that protocol. You can turn them on and off all day long, won't change a thing. So that's how we that's how we built this block, per protocol, per tenant. We started gathering the usage, already talked about that already. And then what we did to begin with, and we did this, I think, in the beginning of like early 2021, was we then picked a bunch of tenants to try and block basic auth for. And we picked tenants that already had security defaults enabled first. We picked a few thousand. Now, if they've already got security defaults enabled, they can't use basic auth, but we picked them thinking they're a pretty safe bunch. So we picked them, we blocked basic auth, nobody said anything. That was good. It wasn't really expected for anyone to start screaming, right? But we just wanted to make sure our process worked. We then took away the requirement for security defaults, and we started small, and we sent 30-day warnings via the message center, told customers, hey, we don't think you're using basic auth, there'll be no impact, we're going to turn you off in 30 days. If you want to opt out, use the diagnostic and tell us. And not many customers did, because they didn't really know what it meant, I guess, probably for some of them, or they certainly, trust us that we said there would be no impact. We watched the self-service diagnostic results, re-enable. Very, very few people did anything, so we started upping it, and we reduced the message center warning to 7 days. So, and that was mainly because it's very difficult to be agile when you have to give 30 days notice, because we started small and realized, oh, that was pretty non-impactful. Let's pick a bigger number and then wait 30 days. That's a long time to wait in this game. So I reduced that to 7 days. By the end of 2021, we turned off millions of tenants, basically, millions. And then we started turning off the individual protocols within the tenants that had some usage. Now, throughout all of this, you have to be able to report to your management chain, kind of how this goes on was one of the other strategic imperatives I mentioned earlier. So this is the actual slide I have used and continue to use, taking all your numbers out, sorry, but this is the slide I used to update Rajesh, Perry, and others on progress. And here's how I broke the problem down from, which is I've got in Exchange Online, I've got this many tenants and this many users. And then I split them into two simple buckets. Those that do not use basic auth, those that do use basic auth. Those that do not use is a much greater number, okay, bigger number. Now, of those that do not use basic auth, a number of them are protected by security defaults, but another number are not. Security defaults is used in millions of tenants, but many of them don't have Exchange in. So these tenants are already protected from basic auth because security defaults are enabled. These are not. So the first thing was I went and picked all of these tenants and I blocked basic auth for them. And then I went back and blocked these as well, because just in case they turn off security defaults, they're still protected. So basically, I blocked, by the end of 2021, millions of tenants. Then we started here, the beginning of 2022, which is of the tenants that use basic auth, there are many, many users in those tenants, but they don't use basic auth. So if you like, a small section of users within these number of tenants are opening up the risk of basic auth compromise to the entire tenant, because the protocol is enabled typically for everyone. Some customers clearly are more sophisticated and have a much greater handle on this, but many, many, many do not. So what we started doing was going by individual protocol. So if you think about this for a second, right, here's my total group number of tenants. And the blue usage at the bottom here is tenants that use basic auth with that protocol. And so if you look at POP and PowerShell, very few of these tenants actually use basic auth with POP, but all of the rest of these tenants, it was enabled in still, so I blocked it. So we started turning off, if a tenant used POP and IMAP, we'd block all basic auth and all the others. That was basically the principle there. Okay, so what are some of the things we did along the way as well? I'm speeding up a little here now as well, because I've been talking too much. Classic. So I mentioned already message center posts. Now, let me be very clear, right? So customers don't read message centers very much, sadly to say. There's an awful lot of information that they get via message center, but it is the main way we try and communicate change to our customers. Reading the message center is incredibly important. I respond to emails every day from customers saying, hey, can I get a bit more time, for this basic auth thing? And my question is, did you read the message that we sent you in message center? Oh, look, there's a message in message center that tells me I can have a bit more time. Reading the message center, really important. That is how we, engineering, think we're going to communicate with you. But people don't really read the messages. But what we've been doing is we use their API to be able to do the biggest mail merge ever, right, of usage. So all of those, what I found was a message to the message center saying, hey, stop using basic auth, go and look in Azure AD reports for any sign of usage is not very actionable. We know how many people are using basic auth in your tenant, so why don't we merge that data in? So we do the mother of all mail merges, usually, every first week of every month. And we send approximate numbers of usage that we saw in the tenant in the previous month to your message center. And that was hopefully much more useful and actionable. Certainly that's the feedback we got. And then the service health dashboard, when we start actually turning stuff off, we post to the service health dashboard because essentially it's a service interruption. And statistically, those posts are read orders of magnitude higher than message center posts. So that's another valuable lesson we learned. We'll be using both message center and SHD when we start turning things off for real in October. One of the more valuable things we did, this is brilliant, is the self-service diagnostic that exists in the admin center. There's a lot of diagnostics already available, and for all kinds of things, from reducing throttling when you're trying to migrate in, and solving all kinds of problems. And when I saw this, and I got the idea from someone else who pointed me at this, and I thought this could be handy, because I love the idea of self-service. When you run a service of this kind of scale, if a customer can go figure it out for themselves and make some changes, and they don't need to call us, it's better for them and it's better for us. So with an amazing team that helped build this, we figured out that we could give customers a chance to re-enable and opt out. Now, every day I see how many people are re-enabling protocols and opting out of protocols. And while we were in our early phases, the ratio, that percentage, which I have here on slide, was very consistent, which also told us that we were picking tenants consistently. Right? There's no way in a distributed system like this I could ever pick it. There's always a chance I might miss a tiny amount of usage or something. But the re-enablement rate was so low, I felt pretty good about that. We stayed consistent. To give you an idea, there are thousands of tenants who re-enabled stuff. Okay, this is the chart. I'm not going to tell you from when, but over the course of time, several tens of thousands of customers have been in and done something, which has saved us tons of reasons to call support, which we've been very happy about. Now, one of the things we've done with Apple as well, hopefully if you saw the blog on this, was, and it goes back to the iPhone problem I was talking about earlier on, there are many devices that are still stuck using basic auth because of Apple's nice and easy upgrade process. So we worked on this project with Apple over a course of a few years, where the device, when it has the right version of their software on it, the right set of conditions, meaning the profile was not pushed there via an MDM, the device would use the credentials stored on the device to go and attempt to get an OAuth token from Azure. And if it's successful, using the ROPC flow, we would then try and migrate the profile to use modern auth rather than use basic auth. Now, a ton of devices have already been migrated like this. But because of a late-breaking bug, this code actually exists in devices, or some version of this code exists in devices from way before iOS 15.6, which is the one we call out in the blog. And so there are pretty much all the devices in most people's hands have some version of this code. But unfortunately, there was a late-breaking change we discovered, which meant that 15.6 became the version we had to get people to. And so, if you are, so some help here would be great too, right? Get people to upgrade their devices. That's a good thing to do anyway, right? Having out-of-date devices is problematic for a number of reasons from a security standpoint. Clearly, the users want the cool new functionality too. That's great. But if they're not MDM managed devices and they can benefit from this, they need to get an update on their iPhone. So let's encourage our collective customers to go get their devices updated. A couple more things I'm quickly going to cover. So proactive protection expansion. That's a cool name for, I'm going to turn off basic auth for your tenant for 48 hours and sort of see what happens. And this is something we hadn't done before. And it was an idea I proposed, and I was told that we should do this. And it was very much targeted at our small customers, being very open with you, right? Many of our small customers, for the reasons I outlined earlier, do not read the message center, do not know this is coming. So interrupting mail flow for a bit to give them a sense of this is going to happen and re-enable and let them re-enable was a decision that we took in order to try and raise our awareness. Now, to give you an idea of how this worked, is I picked small customers who were using a particular protocol, did it with POP, IMAP, ActiveSync, and PowerShell. We posted to the Service Health dashboard, and I picked 20,000 tenants. And nobody raised an eyebrow. There wasn't any issue at all. I thought, well, that's a surprise. Just turned off email for 20,000 people, but turns out they didn't care. So we upped the number. Now, we reached a point around 75,000 per protocol per week, where customers were recognizing there was a problem. Support could handle that if the calls were coming in. And so we persisted like that for a couple of months or so. We ran 1.5 million jobs through the system, which is quite a lot. But you'll see here from the bottom, a very small number of customers actually did anything about it. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it, right? When you turn off email for a number of customers. Now, for some, there's definitely a delayed reaction. They don't realize things have gone away right away. Take ActiveSync as a great example, right? Where they blame it on the internet or Microsoft. we definitely didn't see much of a reaction. Now, one other thing, I'm going to quickly go, and I know we're definitely at 5 minutes here, so I'm going to roll. There's going to be an opportunity for questions in there's a Q&A coming up. We'll do that later today as well. Happy to answer all the questions then for you. Now, this is a bit technical, right? But let's do it. Let's set the Auth 2 client profile enabled flag. The flag in your tenant that controls whether Outlook can do modern Auth for Windows, can do modern Auth or not. That flag was only set to true by default in August 2017. So many of our older tenants had that flag set to false. And that's why, even if you have a perfectly modern version of Outlook, it won't do modern Auth. And so we've been telling customers to turn that flag on for months. And some of them have been really slow doing it. Some of them went ahead and did it. All good. I took a decision that, you know what, we're going to turn it on for you when we get to October anyway. Why don't we look at turning it on a little early? And the data showed that 96% of the usage was from Outlook 2016 Plus, where modern Auth is enabled by default. And there's very few issues with that version of that client. When we tried to do it way back, it was Outlook 2013 was the predominant client, and there were a number of issues around it. And plus, anyway, Outlook 2013, as you probably know, needs a registry key to do modern Auth. But looking at the numbers, it seemed like a pretty safe bet that we could try turning it on for a number of customers to see what would happen. What would happen is, come on, give me this is what happened. About 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, I turned on modern Auth for about 20,000 customers. And they just switched to modern Auth. Do you know how many calls we got to support? None. So the next weekend, I picked 100,000 customers. And 100,000, several 100,000 copies of Outlook switched from basic Auth to modern Auth. Do you know how many support calls we got? None. Reason for that primarily is most people these days are also signed into OneDrive or Teams or something else, and there's a shared Auth model between all of these apps. So Outlook just transitions smoothly from basic Auth to modern Auth with no user intervention. So the following weekend, I flipped the bit on over 300,000 customers. I had one person message us via the message center saying they weren't very happy with me. Well, in the grand scheme of things, I'm sorry if you're that person and you're listening, but I think that's okay. So we've done over 500,000 tenants have now enabled that bit. And usage has come down dramatically, and we've had very few support cases. So I just want you to know that if that bit got turned on in your tenant and you did have an issue, I'd like to know, because so far nobody's told me they had an issue. When we block basic Auth for anyone still using MAPI and RPC and offline address book and so later in October, we're turning the bit on regardless. All right, so I'm going to wrap up with 2 minutes, and there will be a Q&A session later today. Where are we at now? So where we're at now, as I mentioned, is there is an opportunity to get a little more time if you are not ready. Please go in the message center, look at the blog, follow the process, register your opt-out. Trust me, if you don't get an error, we got your request. Don't email me and say, did you get it? I didn't get an error, but I just want to make sure you got it. We got it, okay? Don't worry, we got it. I'm thinking what I probably am also going to do is do a message center post for those of you that read the message center, telling you very close to the, getting maybe a week before we get to our deadline is these are the opt-out requests I've got for you. If you think that's a good idea, do a reaction, add a comment to the chat. I think it's probably a good idea. We can do it. Great, at least somebody wants it. Great. Okay, so, however, if you don't know this is coming, which many customers are not going to, we will turn stuff off in October for you. You can then go and re-enable it. If you know, you can do that. But if you know you could re-enable, why didn't you opt out? Hey, usage is coming down dramatically at the moment. Usage is coming down fast, which is great. Everyone, I kind of had a feeling that it was all going to happen towards the end. Everyone kicks in and does it. But I'm telling you that basic Auth attacks are on the increase. And the customers I'm talking to directly and helping them with Auth policies, they are seeing attacks drop away and disappear. So even if you are going to persist and keep using basic Auth a little bit longer, please use, and I should talk about this in the Q&A. Somebody asked me about this in the Q&A. We'll talk about how you should be blocking basic Auth when it's still enabled at a protocol level, because there are some really good things you can do to prevent being the next account breach that we see for basic auth. Please don't do that. Let me just wrap it up like this. We really mean it this time. You might get a little more time between October and December, but that's it. If you ask for a bit more time, you want it through to December, great. But in January, I am turning off basic auth for you, okay? So listen, we are at time. That is 8:50. I appreciate very much you all joining. I hope this was a little bit of a look behind the scenes, give you an idea of what we've been up to and the effect that it's had. Enjoy the rest of MEC. I'm going to definitely do at least, I think we've got 2 Q&A sessions we're going to do as a follow-up. We can talk about some of this stuff in a bit more detail. Don't just have to answer questions. But thanks for joining. I'm sure there are probably some kind of evals or something that we're going to make you do. So just remember who your friend is and who's protecting all your users' data and your tenant and everything. And on that note, I'll say I think we're done. Enjoy the rest of the show.